Question, show of hands, who has seen the movie The Pirates of the Caribbean? Anybody seen it? You know they have a saying in there, Pirate's Code. Does anyone know what Pirate's Code says? Whoever falls behind is left behind. Oh man, that's tough. So I've looked into my heart. Is tonight the night we're a pirate, or is tonight the night we continue to wait a couple minutes for people to check in their families? And so I don't have Pirate's Code, we have Christian Code. So we're gonna wait a couple minutes for our families to check their kids in. Grateful to have everybody. While you're kind of here, we'll do some orienteering type things. Jessica, if you wouldn't mind sending around our check-in list. I'm really grateful for you guys who are signing in. That helps us just keep our eyes on how many are coming, keep in communication with you all. If you have not yet done so, you can sign up to register for the group online. I try to send a weekly update for you about the logistics and so on, but not more than, so we can keep it kind of light in your inbox. Last week, I also sent out an opportunity for you to sign up to participate, whether it's in serving our dinner out there, which was amazing. Thank you guys for helping with that. Greeting, or even learning some of our tech. So I'm grateful to have Kelly in the booth tonight. She's going to help our online audience experience it a little bit more seamlessly, or if you're ever watching this back, we're grateful for you guys. And then, I don't know, Miguel, if I'm supposed to have this song. I feel like a guy in baseball who's coming in from the outfield. You know what I'm talking about? My walk-up song, yeah. My theme song. Or is it like at the Oscars when they start playing the music? Because that's different. That means, hey man, you're done. Go ahead and move on out of here. I don't know if they still do that. I haven't watched the Oscars in a minute, but awesome. tonight we're going to experiment with some tech stuff to make your online experience a little bit better. So thank you so much for all of your suggestions and hanging in there. Go ahead and put your name in the chat if you want. Let us know who you're watching with at home. And if you have any questions, our inimitable team of staff and volunteers will field some of those. All right, tonight we have a contest, and on the line is a Cafe 4 sweatshirt for anybody who can tell me truthfully that they left this in here 2 weeks ago down front. And if you can tell me that that was you, then you can have it. I'm going to set it here. You don't even have to tell me. You just have to walk up and get it. So there you go. All right. Do we have any first-time people from at 3CU? This is your first time here in the sanctuary. Kelly, welcome. Justin, welcome. Hello, I don't know. Nancy, is that you? Good to see you. Welcome. Thanks for coming. You guys are is that your security team right there to your left? That's good. Maybe you're theirs, who knows? But welcome. Great to have you. And then our sign-up sheet should be coming around. And then, as I said, online, drop your name in the chat. So we're going to do kind of a quick catch-up and review of the last couple of weeks. And so all of the last few weeks are posted on our 3Crosses YouTube channel if you want to come back and watch those. And so my first question is, what is the goal of hermeneutics? And hermeneutics, again, is just using some tools to study the Bible. What's the goal of that? What's the purpose? What are we even doing this whole thing anyway? That's right. So we want to love the Lord with our heart and mind and soul and strength, as Jared put it, just to love the Lord better. That's great. Perfect. Absolutely. So all of this, the goal of this is not just to keep knowledge trapped in our head, but to get ourselves formed more after the character of Jesus Christ, to bear more fruit in his kingdom, and so on and so forth. So what's our key passage from the scriptures that we're kind of centering around here over these next 10 or 12 weeks, or our segment? Yeah, that's the Deuteronomy passage. Deuteronomy 6. It's like you guys think you're going to get into trouble if you answer it, which you totally will. So you're right to be fearful. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, right? You shall, and this is kind of what we just talked about, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength, as Jesus puts it in the Gospel of Luke. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to love the Lord with every fiber of our being. Deuteronomy 6 goes on to say, when should you talk about the law or the Bible? All the time. When you lay down, when you get up, when you go out, when you come in, when you're having dinner with your family, when you're over here at 3CU, this is what we're doing. We're talking about the scriptures and how good that the Lord is. Speaking of having dinner, on Wednesday nights here at the church, we are serving dinner for everybody at 5:45 out there on the bricks. And tonight we had L&L Hawaiian barbecue. Amazing. Amazing. Hawaiian barbecue, different than Kansas City barbecue, but I gave it 2 thumbs up. If you did enjoy the dinner, you can scan our QR code and make a donation if you'd like to contribute. There's no obligation to do that, but it does help us keep our costs defrayed for families and anybody who wants to come up here and enjoy. We'd love to have you next week if you want to make plans to do that. It probably won't be Hawaiian barbecue again, but hey, what can you do? All right, week 1, we talked about a couple traps of hermeneutics, some things that you can do that cause you to fail at this exercise. What is one of the primary traps that we outlined? Anybody remember? Yeah, Jessica? Reading so much about the Bible that you forget to read the Bible itself. Great job. That's one of them. We talked about not doing the study for yourself. There's a number of these, but that's the primary one, I think, is that we get so excited about these other things, we forget to get into the text of the scripture itself. All right, great work. We also talked about this, the doctrine of illumination on week 1. What's the doctrine of illumination? Okay. That is true, but that is my next point on the slide. That is the doctrine of inspiration, that the Holy Spirit has inspired the scripture, or as you put it, all scripture is God-breathed. That's correct out of 2 Timothy. So what's the doctrine of illumination then, Norris?
It's the Holy Spirit actually explaining what the text is.
That's right. So it's the Spirit's role in interpreting the text as you read it, as you understand it. He explains it to you, right? I think about the Gospel of John, when Jesus says, I'll go to the Father, I'll send the Spirit, and he will guide you into all truth, it says. And so this is kind of what we're talking about as the doctrine of illumination. So even as we study with our mind, God is present with us in that process. And it's amazing. All right, he'll reveal things to us, he'll encourage us, he will show us how much he loves us. Even in that process, there is kind of an emotional or an experiential side. All right, this next one is a yes or no question. We talked about this last week. Is the Bible reliable in its production and canonization process? Yes. There we go. There we go. Now you're all caught up. Tonight, on my title slide, I said translation and other fun. What could be more fun than translation? I cannot think of anything, except for maybe philosophy. And so I put both words on the title here, translation philosophy. This is going to be so amazing. All right, so when we talk about translation, what's the goal of translation? Not just necessarily when we talk about the Bible, but just in general. What does translation mean? Lisa.
Be able to speak the language of those who understand the words that you say.
Okay, so speaking a language that makes your words understandable by somebody else. And typically we think about translation, of course, as people coming from two different languages trying to find some sort of common ground, right? So as I put it here, make information in one language understandable in another language. All right, translation, easy or hard? On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put it? What did you say, ocho? This is great. I'm so good at Spanish. I can't wait to show off my Spanish skills. So it's kind of hard. Translation is kind of a known difficult thing, right? And this is for a number of reasons. What are some of the reasons translation is hard to do? Yes, ma'am. I see that hand. Okay, so languages are different. So if you go word for word, as you put it, then sometimes you lose some of the essence of the original language. Yeah, in the back. Is that?
It's not always agreeable.
What does it mean to be agreeable?
I would agree with your translation from my translation and my understanding, so it makes translation hard.
Okay, so you're talking about almost the role of interpretation of a message, trying to understand it, and then you take that message and pass it on to somebody else. And so whoever's doing the translating has to make some judgments or guesses as to what's in the original speaker's mind or heart to communicate that well onto the next person. So this is similar to the telephone game we talked about last time, where we said the scriptures are not like a telephone game because we have good copies written down over the course of time, but translation can be sort of like that, right? We listen to it, we understand it, and we turn it back around. Some languages have a wider range of vocabulary than others. So I only really speak English fluently. Fortunately, English is one of the languages in the world with the widest range of vocabulary. And so this makes English both wildly difficult, but also an amazing kind of single language because we've done so much borrowing of other cultures' words. So if you got a good one, we just take it, right? And then our grammar is also fantastically difficult because we have like a Germanic grammar built on a French vocabulary mashed up with 1,000 years of history, and then here we have English. Amazing. Yes, sir, I see that hand. Is that a hand of encouragement? Or two questions? All right.
Can you give an example of denotation and connotation?
Okay, so we are about to get into some examples, but two of those terms that you just said, denotation is, as I was taught in high school English, is something like the dictionary definition of a word, and then that word connotation that you put is something like the context or emotional range or some sort of like sense of it. And so every language is different, right? And so if you just stick with the denotation, like the literal fixed meaning of the words, we have these spectacular accidents. And so we're going to have some fun with these today. So I made some calls, because I only speak English, as I said. I also speak like 15 words in a lot of languages, and then when we get to word 14, I just bow out, and you're like, oh, wow, that guy's great at whatever language. So here's a language that I know about 15 words in is Malayalam. You guys heard about Malayalam? Spoken in the south of India in Kerala state. My college roommate and best friend, Shibu, is a Malayali speaker. And so he taught me this phrase today, which you say, Oven Shinchipoi. Does anybody know what that means? Oven Shinchipoi. This is a great phrase. You guys are going to love this. Amazing. So denotation, Norris, Oven Shinchipoi means he is looking tired. He is looking tired. But you know what the connotation of this meaning is? He's looking too skinny. He should probably eat something, right? So Avan Shinchipoi in South India means you're looking tired, you should eat something. Now in California, if we tell you, hey man, you're looking skinny, like you've lost weight, is that a compliment or a put down? It's a compliment. In Kerala, if we say, hey man, you're looking skinny, it's kind of a put down. Avan Shinchipoi. Unbelievable, How about that? That guy needs to eat something, looking haggard. All right, I talked to my friend Lana today. She taught me this word hing in Vietnamese. Any Vietnamese speakers in here? Hing means something, if you translated it just by its denotation, something like naive, right? Is naive a good thing or a bad thing in English, typically? Bad, right? You're not worldly wise, easily tricked, confused, but hing in Vietnam is a high compliment because it means that you are not jaded, you're not calloused to the ways of the world, that you're kind of open-minded and peaceful and hopeful. So hing means naive, but it's like a good thing. So we have kind of this backwards thing. All right. Any Spanish speakers in here? Oh, this is going to be great. I cannot wait to embarrass myself in front of you guys. So, Spanish, ¿cómo se dice nutmeg? How do you say the word nutmeg in Espanol? Moscada? Correct or wrong? I mean, far be it from me to correct you, who just, I felt like you knew that for sure. What would you say for nutmeg?
I was thinking that like we don't use it really in my culture. Like I'm from Nicaragua, but nutmeg isn't very common.
You just don't even want to eat it. So like, we don't even have a word for this stuff. Just get it out of my cupboard. We don't want it, right? Okay. Now, so moscada, we'll go with that. There's also another word for nutmeg in Spanish, the word túnel, T-U-N-E-L, tunnel. And this is a soccer word for when your opponent kicks it between your legs to embarrass you. In English, we call this a nutmeg, and in Spanish, they call it a tunnel, like you're going through the tunnel. So the word for nutmeg is either moscado or túnel, depending on what you mean by nutmeg. That's kind of tricky, isn't it? I also learned some amazing things about Spanish soccer players when the ball goes through your legs. They tell you that you should get like a priestly robe. You guys seen these that the Catholic priests wear because it hangs down kind of to your legs, and then that way your priestly robe will block the ball from going between your legs. So I don't remember how to say that in Spanish, but it sounded like a ferocious sick burn. Fortunately, I have an excellent sense of my soccer playing abilities and never play with anybody better than me, which means I never really play. Okay. Miguel, are you too busy up there to come down and further embarrass me down here? I've gotten out of my depth, and so we need to invite another native Spanish speaker down here. So everybody give Miguel a round of applause. Lukewarm. Let's not get him too excited, you know. Let's make Miguel prove it a little bit before he gets down here. But Miguel's one of my best friends, and he is our director of community life here at the church. And so he's helping oversee basically anything we're doing for discipleship work and community at the church. So that's small groups, men's ministry, women's ministry, something like 3CU, as well as being the director of our Spanish ministry, 3Crosses Espanol. And so if you are a Spanish speaker, come out 1 o'clock on Sundays. We do worship and sermon here in the room. Okay, Miguel, how's my Spanish on a scale of 1 to 10?
Ocho.
Ocho. It's church, you may not lie, all right? Dos. That's fine. All right, so Miguel, tell me about the YouTube channel you sent me today. What's her name?
Super Holly.
Super Holly. And what does she do?
So there's this YouTube channel that kind of trains you into Spanish. So if you speak Spanish, it will train you to speak English, and they will show you like words. And if you speak English, it will show you like the Spanish words, and that's really great. Super Holly is one word.
We have a link coming on the screen, I actually realized. I'm so good at this. All right, so some more fun with Spanish idioms.
Yeah.
All right, this one is a great thing that I learned here today. Ojo el cubismo. What does that mean?
Ojo de cubero.
Oh, cubero? I
Yes.
don't know. I can't even copy and paste right in Spanish. We're going to move that ocho down to dos, down to 1.8.
Yeah, 1.0, yeah. Ojo de buen cubero, it means like you can like guesstimate really good.
Okay, but it means, denotation, to see with an eye of a cubist. Like a Picasso is a cubism style painter.
Yep.
So to see with the eye of a cubist means you can guesstimate pretty well.
Very well.
So like how much salt goes in here, right? See it with the eye of a cubist and send it along. But if I said see with the eye of a cubist in English, you'd be like, what in the world are you talking about? All right, what do you say to somebody, Miguel, if they are zoning out in class, they're thinking about something else, their mind is not on the situation at hand?
Is that the one that you have written there?
What do you say?
Is that one that you have written there?
This one, yes.
Yeah, pensando en la inmortalidad del cangrejo.
How do you say that in English, just literally translated?
It's thinking about the immortality of the crab.
Thinking about the immortality of a crab. Doesn't make any sense in English. But in Spanish, this is what you say. Are you contemplating the lifespan and how a crab might go to heaven? Maybe you're doing that now. Why are they having all this fun with Spanish idioms, right? All right. When we... Oh, here it is. Is this spelled more correctly?
Uh-huh.
All right. When in Spanish we're talking about a stinky cat. What is this one? Or a cat that's locked up in a cage so much that it begins to smell.
Huele a gato encerrado. Yeah.
Yeah. What does that mean?
It's like, there's something wrong here.
There's something wrong here.
Yeah.
The cat is smelling.
Yeah. Huele a gato encerrado, yes.
Yeah, see, gato, you got to keep him on his toes. You don't even know if he's good at speaking Spanish or
So,
not. He
yeah,
could be
that's fine.
faking it. I have no idea.
I do speak Spanish really fast, so.
That's fine. I speak English really fast, so that we make a good team. We make a good team. And so this is something like the English word like fishy. Something smells fishy, right? And so we know what that means. But in Spanish, you don't say that. You talk about how the cat's locked up in prison. And I'm not really a cat person, but prison is like maybe a bridge too far. I don't know. Okay, I learned this from Super Holly today. What if we say that we're looking for 3 feet on the cat? How do you say that in Spanish?
Buscándole tres patas al gato, no? It's like you're looking for some kind of detail that is hidden, or something like that.
So you're looking for a hidden detail, 3 feet on the cat. And then I also learned from Super Holly, who is on YouTube, therefore can be trusted 100% of the time. If you're in a Latin country other than Mexico, you would say looking for 5 feet on the cat to mean exactly the same thing. You're looking to find some hidden detail or to try to create an issue out of something which isn't there. Like, why are you trying to stir up an argument here? Why are you looking for the 5th foot on the cat? Something like that. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Oh, wow, everybody's learning something today. Probably it's true. All right, so that's all I have. This is Super Holly on YouTube. It was a lot of fun to watch this for a couple minutes. This isn't our main thing, is to teach you Spanish and English and Vietnamese and Malayalam, but you get the idea, right? We know that this is a thing that happens between languages, and so not just idioms, but also some expressions and some vocabulary and something like that. So Miguel, thank you so much. Give Miguel a hand. And then Miguel, hand that microphone to Marissa. Marissa is going to run around and stick a microphone in people's face if they want it. Did you drop it? Oh, man. All right. That's fun. I love stuff like that. I could do stuff like that all day. Oh, I forgot to tell you the one that Tara taught me today in Norwegian. And I don't speak any Norwegian. I'm not even going to try to embarrass myself with Norwegian pronunciation. But literally translated, it means to get your beard stuck in the mailbox. And in Norwegian, this means something like, you have entrapped yourself in a sticky situation through your own deceit. And so, like, you were trying to trick somebody, but you got tricked, and now your beard is stuck in the mailbox. Amazing. Amazing, right? So these translation problems, like, we know the challenge with this stuff. Does anybody actually translate for a living or do anything for, like this, kind of in their life? Are you good at it? Do you want to translate my sermons into Spanish right there on the spot? So you translate for doctors. That's amazing work. I think that's great. People need to know what they're getting into, and you have to understand as best you can in your native language. Translating for people who are speaking, I think it's really hard to do because you're listening, you're changing it into a different language, and you're speaking it, and you're trying to make it in a way that it makes sense, that it carries the sense of the speakers, like even their humor. So sometimes when I preach with the translator, and if there are bilingual people in the congregation, sometimes I'll make a joke in English, and then like 1 or 2 people will laugh, and then the translator will say the same thing, and then nobody laughs. All right, this does happen to a lot of my jokes, I'm aware of that, but often, like when you translate humor, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because humor is a very cultural kind of a thing. Sometimes you translate the joke, it makes sense. There's expressions that can happen in other languages. I remember one time we were in Africa on missions trip, and my friend Shibu, who I told you about before, my Malayali-speaking friend, he made some sort of short statement, paused for the translator, who went on for like a couple minutes, and then the congregation was like laughing and cheering, and he's like, hey man, what did you do? He's like, oh, I just made it better, So you can have this kind of a translation style as well, and so we're familiar with this. Some stuff needs to be very precise, like medical language has to be precise. Humor needs to catch the sense of what they call a receptor language, the language you're translating it into. And then depending on the style of communication you're using, you might pick a different style of translation. All right, you guys understand kind of where I'm going, what we're picking up, what we're putting down? Because this exact same thing comes into bear when we're talking about translating the scriptures from the ancient languages in which they are written into languages that we read here today. Marissa, Peggy has a question. You're going to regret everything.
In sign language, there are, even here in America, there are a couple different ways to translate. Like if we had one translating you tonight, it would be one way, but if we were talking to our children, depending on if we want them to learn just conversational English or signing exact English, so that when they went to school, they would learn how to write conversation and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
in sign language, there's three.
So yeah, same kind of thing. Are we conversational, informal? Is this formal? Is this what level? And those are not wrong choices. It's just a personal choice for a situation, right? So this happens in any kind of translation experience that we have. You know, I like to read Russian literature. There's like a huge fight about whether you need to read the old translators who are more like literal rigid or the newer translators who are like updating stuff into more modern styles of English. Are we going to lose something of the sense of what Tolstoy was trying to bring across if we are too free with our translation? So what we're talking about tonight is not just a Christian Bible thing. It's a thing for any ancient document, really any sort of translation stuff. The Bible has some particular challenges, and we'll talk about some of these. And then English as a receptor language, we'll talk primarily about tonight. We have some challenges in English. One of the worst things about English is we have no plural form of the word you. So we say you, it means you as an individual or you as a group, right? And in the South, we've solved it. We say y'all, right? There we go. And we're loaning this out to all the different parts of the country. In other languages like German, there's a word for you singular, a word for you singular and familiar, like my friend, and then a word for you plural and you plural formal. And so, like, just depending on the language, you have a different kind of a range. So, God bless you, online people, but I can't see what I'm doing. Only you can. So we're walking by faith and not by sight. So each style of translation tries to overcome these problems we're talking about in a different way. So we have three terms tonight. These are kind of from the field of biblical studies. But as I said, there's a range into some other domains as well. And so number one is this translation philosophy is called formal equivalence. It doesn't mean formal like in the way you dress up with a tuxedo to go to prom. It means form as like adhering to a set structure or a specific way of doing things. This is a more literal or what they call word for word type translation. So when we say like to look for 5 feet on the cat, we would translate that just as I did, looking for 5 feet on a cat. And then they would say, we want to keep the formal equivalence so you get the sense of what that Spanish expression is. We are not going to update the meaning. We're going to just leave it with those forms or those words, and even sometimes word order. So like in Spanish, right, if you say blue car, you actually say car blue, right? And then in English, we say blue car. So a very highly formally equivalent translation would render it backwards for English hearers to keep the word order from the Spanish more correctly. Greek is an amazing, ancient Greek especially is an ancient language because their word order has nothing to do with grammar, it's emphasis. So if they want to emphasize the blueness of the car, they put blue first, and if they want to emphasize the car itself, they'll put the car first. So word order is really only for emphasis. And man, it gets crazy in there when you're trying to translate. So if we were going to do a formally equivalent, we'd leave that choppy word order even if it doesn't make that much sense in English. This is a highly formal equivalent way of solving these problems. Sometimes it works and sometimes it's a good choice. Medical field, you're probably doing highly formally equivalent stuff because we've just got to be very technically precise. We don't care a lot about the beauty of your medical document. We want it to be precise. It's a terrible way to translate poetry because what the beauty of your stuff is just mangled. All right, second way of overcoming these issues is something called functional equivalence. So we don't necessarily, in this translation philosophy, care so much about the specific words or word order or things like that. We are going to try to make a functionally equivalent thought. And so if we're looking for 5 feet on the cat, we might update that to a similar English idiom, like, why are you stirring the pot? Right? So there's nothing in Spanish about pot or stirring, but you at least know that it's a figure of speech, right? This is a functional equivalent kind of an approach. Or we could say something like, why are you making a problem where there is none? Why are you inventing a problem for us? This is a functionally equivalent translation. And so this is a good way if you care about the meaning and some of the beauty, but we lose that adherence to the original. Like, it might be really fun to learn that Spanish, we're actually talking about cats and 5 feet. That could add to the depth of your understanding of the original. We lose that when we go to functional equivalence. But it's a much better way to hear it in your native language a lot of times. All right, and then the third way is what they call a more free translation, where this one is not even, this is like, you just read it and then you just come up with something yourself that connects to it. It's a more, as the name implies, free way of doing it, right? And so this would be, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. Oh, see, now you're looking ahead a little bit. Yeah, because there are different Bible translations which match each of these translation philosophies. Jared?
Would that be a paraphrase?
So paraphrase is, yes, kind of a way to think about it, depending on how, like, each paraphrase can probably fit into either that number 2 box or number 3 box. But the more paraphrasey it gets, the more towards free translation that we get. So some of this stuff is a bit more art than science, for sure, but these are the 3 ways that we overcome it, right? And each of these ways can be good. We're going to talk about some of the pros of each of these ways tonight, as well as some of the cons. And then we're going to talk about the different translations of the Bible we have in English and where they all fit into this philosophy. And then we'll look at some examples of them side by side. So I'm actually really looking forward to this because I love stuff like this. Did you guys do your homework? Do you remember your homework? Read a passage, John 1, and also Matthew 5 and 6 in 5 different translations, right? And we're going to look at John 1 tonight and see. Did I say 4? Oh, excuse me, Professor. Let's not get carried away. 5. Cinco, cuatro. Who knows the difference? Not me. All right. All right, so the most common way of going about Bible translations is that kind of second box, functional equivalence. Some people don't like this, though, because if we're starting to change the words of the Bible, which we just talked about are inspired by God, you got to do that with some trepidation, don't you? And so if God tells me that I'm looking for 5 feet on the cat, but then I don't say 5 and I don't say cat, have I really valued the very words of Scripture as much as I need to? So in a sense, the stakes feel really high. And they should, right? Because this is the message of God to us in written form. We should care about it a lot. But I wanted to kind of draw this comparison to our modern translation stuff because I want to demystify it. We do this all the time. This is how humans communicate. There's nothing scary here. There's good reasons to do any of the 3, depending on what you're going for, what you're looking for. And so I want to just explain the philosophies behind it. And then at the very end, if we don't run out of time, I'll make sure we don't run out of time. We'll talk about kind of some one-stop shopping that I recommend, as well as Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, which we recommended this book week 1, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. They have a whole chapter in here about translation philosophy, and tonight I am borrowing heavy from that chapter with including some quotes and so on. And so if you'd like to check this out, it remains a great tool. All right. In fact, I have a quote from them right now. This is going to be so exciting. All right, so theory of translation, as they put it, has basically to do with whether to put primary emphasis on formal or functional equivalency. That's a typo. That's my fault. It's not their fault. We would call this a textual variant if we were talking about stuff last week. All right, that's a history joke. It's not that funny. All right, for example, should lamp be translated as flashlight or torch? That's a UK word for flashlight. In cultures where these serve the purpose a lamp once did? Or should you translate it as lamp and let readers bridge the gap for themselves? Should holy kiss be translated the handshake of Christian love in cultures? That's another typo. This is embarrassing. Where public kissing is offensive? Should coals of fire become burning embers or coals, since this is more normal in English? Should endurance inspired by hope in 1 Thessalonians 1:3, a formal equivalence that is almost meaningless in English, be rendered your endurance inspired by hope, which is what Paul's Greek actually means, even though there's no word for your in there? So this is kind of what we're talking about, and getting some specific examples from the Bible, right? Any of these are good options depending on what you're going for. So this is the road we're going to walk through tonight. This is on pages 44 and 45 of that book, which I just showed you. Okay, so we have in English almost an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the range of translations that we have. So last week we asked our Spanish speakers, what version do you read? And basically, how many versions of the Spanish Bible are there in English, or in the United States? I was going to say, how many versions of the Spanish Bible are there in English, which is dumb. There are 0. There's like 2, right? So they have the Reina Valera, which is kind of like an equivalent to the King James, and there's the NIV. Those are the basic 2 options in Spanish. There's probably a few others that are coming out, but like for a long time, that was it. And then in English, how many do we have in English? I think it's infinity, right? The limit does not exist, as somebody once put it. And so we have this range of translations, and they do span philosophic-wise from formal equivalence, kind of that word for word, very literal, into functional equivalence, and into free. So we're going to kind of walk that journey here over the next couple of minutes. And so some of these, which are more interested in formal equivalence, include the King James Version and then the New King James Version. Anybody heard of these? They're big. They're big time. The King James was the first English version of our scriptures, authorized by King James, no surprise, in 1611. Master of social media, this guy put his name right on the cover, King James I, the Confessor. They didn't have social media back then, but he did put his name on the cover. Fun fact, 2 fun facts. My first fun fact, the term fun fact is redundant. All facts are fun. Second fun fact, King James wanted his name in the New Testament. And so they went in there, and where Hebrew and Greek render Jacob, they put James into the New Testament. And so the book of James is actually, in Greek, the book of Jacobos, Jacob. And now in English, we have it. James, the brother of Jesus, actually Jacob, the brother of Jesus. And so this thing stuck around from 1611. How about that? Dwight, do you have a question, comment, or agreement? Hopefully all of the above. Great question. So Dwight's asking if we have the NIV, is that translated using an older English version like the King James, or is it translated by going back to the original text? The answer for the NIV is that it goes back to the original texts, although there are some which are basically updates from the King James. So without getting caught in the weeds, the King James is actually very good, especially for its time. And so if people are out here trashing the King James, I'm not really here for it, because it's a great work of scholarship, especially for something in 1611. It's really beautiful language, and so it has this poetic quality that I think has really gripped the hearts of so many, right? But the problem with it is that it's from the 1600s, and nobody really talks like that anymore. And so it's easy to misunderstand it. So if you read Shakespeare, it kind of just, we don't talk like that. And so the King James has kind of been a little bit outmoded. The second problem with the King James is that it relies on a little bit weaker Greek manuscripts. And so there's a document called the Textus Receptus. This is not on the slides because they didn't think to put it on there. I need to work on my prophetic foresight. And that's the oldest, complete Greek document that we have. But between 1600 and now, we've discovered more and better texts of the New Testament that are helping us fill out some of those changes. And so the King James doesn't rely on our best, most ancient ones. Like last week we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The King James didn't have that update in time to translate. So there are some even verses or chapters which are a little bit different. The New King James is an updated English translation, but it uses that older Greek text. Fee and Stewart, these guys, they are not afraid to clown translations. They say the New King James, they say, not me, email your comments to not me, they say the New King James gets rid of the good parts of the King James, being that historic quality and poetic language, but keeps the bad parts of the King James, including that textual outmodedness. And I thought, if I had made the New King James, that would have hurt a little bit. Their thoughts, not mine. So this is a little bit of the King James, New King James. Some people really feel like the King James is the only version that you should read, and I think that that is a well-meaning but unfortunately flawed mindset. I think that a range of English translations typically is a little bit better. Yes, Peggy?
On any version of the Bible that is New King James Version, should we actually look at the copyright date to see if it has these new, complete, found, updated words?
Okay, good question. So you're talking about some translations have updates in different copyright dates. All of the New King James or King James have this same textual basis for them hiding underneath there. There's not an update of the New King James published as such. I don't know, unfortunately, but I could Google it. All right, another formal equivalent version is the New American Standard Bible, and then what has been updated and now called the Holman Christian Standard Bible. This is a formal equivalent basis translation that looks at the most up-to-date textual scholarship that we have. So if you wanted something that felt like the New King James, this would actually be my suggestion for you, is to read a New American Standard or a Holman Christian Standard, because I think the textual basis for it is better, but it tries to continue to be literal or formal in its equivalencies. All right, we'll talk about some examples of these going forward, but those are kind of the main ones that you see out there that are interested in formal equivalence. Yes, James?
Hey, Buzz, quick question. If there's some big names out there like King James, ESV, NI, or ESC, NIV, outside of that, just a random person wants to verify that the Bible that they're reading actually came from text. Is there any way, any direction you would point them in?
So at the very end, after I walk you all around this bush that we're beating around, I'm going to hit you with, this is the one you should buy.
Thanks.
So that's right. That's a great question, because sometimes we want to get down to brass tacks. Like we're flinging like 58 acronyms at me, which is the good ones and which is the bad ones. So, and then also, sorry, I may have missed your question. So.
That would be the second part of it, but the original part would be, okay, if I was just reading this Bible, how would I be able to verify that it actually came from the text, outside of us just knowing?
Okay, good question. So how can we as a reader verify the claims the Bible translators are making about the text? Basically, you have to trust them, number one. Number two, anything from a publishing house, like a Zondervan or the Holman Publishing House, they have the gatekeepers and the translation committees to keep each other on track. You can read about how these translation committees were formed and basically hopefully get into their mindset of their goals and so on and so forth. So stuff which is published by one person and self-published on the internet, like I'm suspicious of that kind of a thing. Something which goes through a formal clearinghouse, we can trust at least to try to meet its aims. So pretty much everything I'm sharing tonight, you can read and I'd be very happy. And I'd say like, amazing, you're going to meet God on these pages. All right. So we have the section of Bible translations that are more interested in functional equivalence. So not trying to get so wooden and word for word, but we're trying to get into the functional equivalence. Yes, Jessica?
So my question is, sorry, that was really loud.
Yeah, that's the
So
blue
I
mic.
did
It's
read-
powerful.
I did read the King James Version and the American Standard Version as part of my homework. And I noticed that there were italicized words, which when I Googled, it was because it was like the translation. Like there were words that we didn't have in the English language. But what I got confused on is why would there be different words italicized in both of those versions? Like the sentence would be the same, but there would be different words that were translated differently.
I'm glad you asked. And when we look at our examples side by side on the screen, we're going to talk about why some of those versions have those italicized words. The short version is the italicized words are not in the Greek manuscript, and they're supplied by your translators. Because those translations care so much about being word for word, they will indicate for you where they are not being. So that's kind of how they slide in those italicized stuff. We can talk more about some specifics when we hit with the screen. So these translations, which are more concerned with our functional equivalents, include the New Revised Standard Version. This is the one that they made me use when I was in college and seminary. That was considered to be one of the best. It's a little bit old by now, but it is still not bad. There is a new kid on the block, however, the English Standard Version, ESV. This is seen a lot as something like a gold standard. It's very good. We're going to talk about some of its weaknesses tonight as well, but it's quite good. New International Version, NIV, and so Peggy was asking about the copyright dates of New King James. NIV has seen a lot of updates and a lot of revisions, and so that is one that you probably do want to check the publication date on, because one of them was kind of like wonky, but it's actually hard to find. It was so bad they just basically trashed it and started over. And then one called the New American Bible, which is not that popular, but these guys who wrote this book, they really like it. All right. So NIV, I have this on the slide later. This is our default Bible at 3Crosses NIV. So when we teach in church, or when we used to be able to have shared Bibles in here, they were all NIV. And there's strengths and weaknesses to the NIV. My grandfather, who was in seminary, his teacher, Ralph Earl, was one of the heads of the original NIV translation committee. So he used to like to call it the never incorrect version. So don't argue with Grandpa. All right, we got another question.
How different is the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version?
Not that different.
I'm a little older than you, and my grandparents gave me Revised Standard Version when I was 9.
Yeah, they're not that different.
Okay.
I mean, over the course of time, we do get better at understanding ancient languages, knowledge increases, and so on and so forth. But basically, it's the same. English has changed from 1984 to 2021, but like not that much. It's not like it's 1611 we're talking about. So there is some dynamics, but between those two, there's not that much difference. Yes, we'll go over here.
I have a question about there's a new English translation that's like web-based, but they are published by the Biblical Studies Press.
Oh.
NET version.
NET,
and so they
yeah.
include like 60,000 translators' notes.
Yes, so that is one that I am not as intimately familiar with, but if you send me an email at buzz@3crosses.org, I'll look at it for you. I love translations, though, as a little bit of an aside, that have notes and footnotes and so on that explain. Those are great. We'll talk about those in a second. All right, we'll come over here. Is that my friend Richard?
Yes.
I'm glad we're friends.
Is the Message version considered the free equivalent or the free form?
Oh, so would you number yourself among those more interested in free translation? Because we'll get there. Good question. We will get there. And then we'll come to this question before we do get there.
Hi, I'm Nancy. New Living Translation, where would that fall? NLT.
Here we go. So the New Jerusalem Bible is one that's a free translation. I'm not familiar with it. The textbook authors really love it. New Living is right here. And so New Living is considered to be a free translation. And it was, I believe, in its origins, translated by a committee that was like, really all we got is the King James, we got to get something better. And so then they pulled out the New Living. There is a newer one called the Passion Bible that my mother-in-law likes a lot. This is considered to be a free translation. And then here also Richard will put something like the Message. Now, this is where it's nice to know about the goals of the translator. So the Message is basically No Bones About It by Eugene Peterson, offered as something like a paraphrase. Now, the Passion Bible is, to me, almost as much of a paraphrase, but it offers itself much more as a translation, and then it makes you feel like it's word for word. And so I don't feel like it's quite as open about its own goals. But if you're aware of its strengths and weaknesses, it can actually be quite good. We'll look at some segments of the Passion Bible tonight. Passion Bible is translated by a church in Redding, California. Can't think of their name, but they make all of our worship music. I can't think of their name. It's Bethel Church. And so that's kind of where that comes out of. And so then any translation which comes out of somebody, they have a goal and a point and an agenda, not in a bad way, but just you should be aware of what those all are doing. So the Message's goal and agenda was, nobody talks like this anymore. Like, I'm working with blue-collar, industrial kind of people, I need something that speaks to them. And so that was Eugene Peterson's way of going about it. And then the Passion Bible was like, so many translations are so wooden and there's no heart in here. We need some more of our emotional impact back. And so then they did the Passion, which again, I like it. So hopefully you don't feel like I'm saying don't read it, but that's its goal, is to infuse passion and energy. And so sometimes it, to me, overshoots the mark. All right, can we hold that one? I'm sorry, we're running a little behind on time, Peggy. I apologize. All right, then there's one other that was very famous. And then again, not me, but Gordon Fee and Stewart said of the Amplified Bible. You guys heard about the Amplified Bible? They said that this is a translation whose popularity has far outstripped its worth. And I was like, boom, roasted, right? So the Amplified Bible is one where you'll have a word, and then in parentheses it will list like a bunch of other possible meanings of that word. And so what they're trying to do is to do that formal equivalence, stay word for word, but also be a free translation all at once. And it ends up being very confusing to me and almost unintelligible. And so some people really like it, but I'm not among them. I would rather us choose something different. But it was like super popular in the mid-2010s. Okay, so we have had a lot of questions and a lot of interest in this stuff. So I would love to look at one of our verses with a lot of different translations, and we'll just kind of get some of the sense of the differences and see how far we go. So John 1:14, we'll just look at one verse, and then we're going to look at as many translations as I can stand before I get too tired. And then we'll move on. So here's King James, and I like the King James because I memorized this as a third grader at Berean Christian School, and so when I think about John 1:14 in my heart, I think this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. All right, that's King James, and so this is formal equivalence, trying to be very word for word from the Greek. All right, the ESV is another one of those more formally equivalent ones on the range, and so it says it this way: and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. All right, so you can see some of those differences. If we wanted to even, sometimes it's fun to take some colored pencils and like mark out some of the differences or where are the words added. So here at the tail end of the King James, it says, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The ESV omits that who came, right? So then you could look at your Greek original and see, does it say that he came, or is that implied? And so actually you'll find that it's implied. And so the King James adds that verb to keep it moving. All right, New Revised Standard. This is one of the more, they used to call it dynamic equivalent, functional equivalency. That's the word we're looking for. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. All right. Do you see that little, right after it says, the glory as of a Father's only Son, and then there's a little footnote A? All right, that is a note that I've left in from the original New Revised Standard because that is an indicator that we have one of these translation issues in play. They are making a choice between formal or functional or free equivalence, and they're letting you know, here's a spot where we've made a choice. Check in the margins, just like you were mentioning, check in the footnotes, and we will tell you what the options are. And then depending on what Bible you have, it'll be either more full or more narrow in explaining some of those choices. And so I'm really grateful that NRSV flagged that because that is a great word in the Greek that we have no English equivalent for, and so people are trying to like figure it out. The NRSV flags that for us. You see the same thing right there in the ESV, right? Glory is of the only Son, A, from the Father, full of grace and truth. All right, NIV is going to feel very similar. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory as of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. All right, so these feel very similar. You see some of the phrasing's different. Some verbs have become adjectives, one and another, but they feel very much the same. All right, now we're going to get into the New Living, which is a more free on that scale. So the Word became human, footnote, and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, footnote, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. Okay? So they've there chosen the word human instead of the word flesh, right? And the Greek word sarx means flesh or body. In Latin, the word is carne, which in Spanish has become something like meat, but in Latin means something more like just physical substance. And the New Living is updating that to human so that you don't get lost that actually what we're talking about is God's become a person, a human being. And the word flesh doesn't make that much sense in 1990s English, so we're going to update that and make sure that you don't miss it. We're going to footnote that to put it right there. Dwight, yes, sir. Okay, so capitalization is a question Dwight's asking me for. Some versions will capitalize any word referring to God, and other versions will choose to not do that. So, for example, here in the New Revised Standard, you see the glory as of a Father's only Son. They don't capitalize Father, even though it might refer to God. And so that's for one of two reasons. One, the New Revised Standard is saying it might just be that it's like any father loves any son, just like there's fatherly love. That could be the word picture at play here. Or it could be that the New Revised Standard just has gone away from that capitalization motif. In academia, and therefore most publishing that's not from the Christian publishing houses, they've gone away from what they call divine capitalization, just generally speaking. And so depending on the date and the publishing house, they'll either have that or not. So you see in the NIV, where it talks about the Word became flesh, capital W, glory of the one and only Son, capital S, who came from the Father, capital F, the NIV is choosing to highlight those words which refer to the deity, whether it's Jesus Christ or God the Father. I like divine capitalization personally because I think it makes it clear. And then I'm also old school. Like I told you, I grew up on the King James, so it feels like, let's not take away God's capital letters, right? But also it's not necessarily so insidious either. It's just a choice that they can make. Sure. That's true, but most of the Bible translators aren't making that point, that God is only just a normal generic person. That's why I'm saying it's not so insidious. They're just choosing to use lowercase letters. So even though we might feel something's implied, most Bible translators would say, that's actually not the message I'm trying to say here. They've just kind of gone away from that in recent years. We'll talk about some other changes Bible translations have made in recent years, and they're essentially neutral. Yes, ma'am. Michelle. The Greek has no capitalization, spacing, or punctuation, so we don't actually know. In fact, it's like they write with caps lock on. It's all big letters. Maybe they're just yelling the Bible at us, who knows? All right, here's the Passion Translation. This is one that I talked about before as a free translation, kind of wanting that emotional oomph. And it says, "So the living expression became a man and lived among us. We gazed upon his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, overflowing with tender mercy and truth." All right? So you see that more poetic quality, that punchier quality, but yet if you look at the more word-for-word stuff, they've made some choices. So the one and only is kind of set aside and made disjunctive, is the fancy word I was going to say, separated from the expression, the Father's only Son. So is it the one and only just on its own, or are we talking about the Father's only Son here? You'll also notice the Passion uses capital letters anytime it's referring to God. It's kind of an old school way of doing it. And then the last is the Message. I used to really not like the Message. I've come around. They wore me down. It says this: "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish." So this one you see has a more poetic quality, some imagery moving into the neighborhood. This is a 1990s way of talking about something, not a 90s AD way of talking about something, and so they have updated. I say 1990s because that's when Eugene Peterson was working on his translation of John. Anyway, so which is right? Which is the right one? They are all useful in the niche that they are useful for, if you understand what that niche is. That's what I would say. So you can see they're highlighting some of these words, they're talking about these phrases. Throughout the night, we're going to talk about maybe some of the actual reasons why they've made these, but this is just a way to look at a passage a bunch of ways side by side. This is actually a fairly good way to do your Bible study anyway. This is why I made you pick 4 of these, because you get that range. You can see the word-for-wordness if you look at an ESV style. You can be inspired with the emotional impact if you look at a more free style. You can look at some halfway in between stuff, and it can really round out, I think, our love for the Scriptures. All right, we are not going to talk about, I was going to have us vote on the best one, but actually we vote with our dollars when we buy it on Amazon. That's what they taught me in economics class. So, pros and cons. Formal equivalence, this is kind of summing up what we've already talked about. I like formal equivalence because it shows the most original text. You can trace it most easily from the English back to the Greek. It's really good. Con, it can be wooden, and sometimes it loses its precision. We'll talk about some important ways it does that in a couple of minutes, which is a bit counterintuitive because you'd think that formal equivalence wants to be the most precise or literal, but sometimes it's actually the most confusing, in my view. Functional equivalence has some pros, right? It's more understandable English, right? Those NIVs or NRSVs, often they round out some of those confusing spots. It gives it some clarity. It can carry a little bit more poetic quality, which can be nice. But the problem is that it relies on your translation committee to make good decisions. So in a spot where we have an option, they are choosing an option for you. And you're basically trusting your translator to have done a good job. And I'm telling you, 99% of the time, they do a great job. There's nothing to worry about, but we need to be aware they're making some decisions for us. And then free translation, this is good when it stimulates interpretive thinking for us. Like, I love that expression, moved into the neighborhood. It's teaching me that, like, God moved into our world, again, a closeness that's easy to lose if we have that starchier King James phrasing. But to me, they can slip into commentary and not even really translation. The word neighborhood is nothing in the Bible. That glory of the one and only, like, that's not really coming from the Greek words. That's like inspired by the Greek words. It's like this guy's poem about John 1:14. And so we have to be careful with it when we think about it as a translation. Now, free translation is very common if you look at things like Homer or stuff from the Latin like Dante. Like, this is not only a Bible thing. They do this a lot in some of those more ancient texts. And so this is, again, on the range of things which are normal for humans to do. A lot of Christians, especially Christians kind of from our slice of the faith background, we love the formal equivalence because we believe the very words of God, singular word, Greek and Hebrew, in its original manuscripts. A lot of us will tend to lean towards formal equivalence. And honestly, that's probably a good way to lean. But free translations are not that scary. Okay. We're going to move on to some particularly sticky wickets. I was very proud of this title of this slide, by the way, because it is itself an idiom in English, but in what they call the Queen's English from the UK. Anybody grew up in a kind of a British English type home, whether in the West Indies or India or United Kingdom or anything like that? No? Well, I watch soccer, so I learn everything about the world. That's my portal into culture. Does anybody know where this term sticky wicket comes from? And what it means? You do, Rita? Or are you just like so excited? And is that Rita? It's hard for me to see you guys' faces with the lights on. It's not Rita? Well, who are you? Who art thou, right? This is what, I feel like Samuel in the book of Samuel. It's not me. All right, sticky wicket comes from cricket, which is a game like baseball, but different. There's only two bases, and they call them bowlers and not pitchers, and sticky wicket basically means you've gotten yourself into trouble. A sticky wicket is like, I just can't get this guy out, to use baseball kind of lingo. So these are particular challenges that translations have. Like, there are kind of 6 things we'll talk about tonight that are very difficult to translate, and we have all of the issues we've kind of talked about in general that we'll talk about in specific. So these are 6 particularly sticky wickets. All right, the first one is weights and measures and money. This is a particularly sticky wicket. So should we keep what they call cultural distance and therefore be literal and precise? So cultural distance would be like, my culture uses dollars and feet and miles, but the Old Testament world, New Testament world, they did not use those. So if we use dollars, feet, miles, we are now culturally distant from the New Testament world. Does that make sense? And then this lets us be literal and precise. I'm going to use a measure that you understand so that you can understand what it is, or we can be specific, because how long is 3,000 cubits? I don't know, but if they say 481 miles, like, you know how long that is, right? Those are probably not analogs. Those are just kind of expressions to get you the sense of what I'm talking about. All right, or we can go the other way. We can reduce the cultural distance and therefore be more understandable. So should we talk about cubits or should we talk about feet? Do we want to talk about the things they did in the ancient world for themselves, and therefore we're not going to make any mathematical errors or any guesses? Or do we want to reduce the cultural distance and talk about how to be understandable? And then the third problem is, if we update these measurements, to what should we update them? And so this is tricky because in English, we have what we call English measures, which is not English language measures necessarily, but what they call the imperial system. This is like feet, yards, stones if you're in the United Kingdom. If you're in an English-speaking country, primarily English-speaking country like Canada, they don't use miles. They went crazy and used metric, right? Meters, kilometers, grams, etc. Or do we want to use like round numbers for a sense of scale? Do we want to say like 400 miles as opposed to 481 miles? Because 400 makes kind of a nice sense, but then you're not actually translating the precise distance. Now you're using a kind of a, so you see kind of the issue that we're getting at here? All right, let's talk about some particulars in the Bible where some different translations have made different choices with weights and measures and money. And so this is Isaiah chapter 5, verse 10. First, I'm going to read you the King James. All right. Yea, 10 acres of vineyard shall yield one bath, and the seed of a homer shall yield an ephah. What? Something's happening. I don't know what is happening. So the King James has chosen to render the measurements in the ancient way. And so the Hebrew word for ephah is ephah. The Hebrew word for homer is homer. And the King James is just bringing it across. This is a formally equivalent way of doing weights and measures. But now we're so culturally distant from those measures, you have no idea what he's talking about. Is this good? Is this bad? I have no idea. Right? And so the Good News Bible, which is a different translation, more in the middle, has rendered it this way. The grapevines growing on 5 acres of land will yield only 5 gallons of wine. 10 bushels of seed will produce only 1 bushel of grain. All right, now you get a sense of the scale, of the dynamics. He's talking about a famine. He's talking about it's difficult to produce. This is not a good thing. Right? But the Hebrew doesn't talk about bushels. It doesn't talk about gallons. It doesn't talk about acres. Right? So we have updated the weights and measures. There are good reasons to do both. These are just two different choices from two different translations. All right, let's look at another one. I learned my lesson. I'm not throwing my notes. I'm just putting them down here. This is the parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew chapter 18. Let me look at my inscrutable notes here. I forgot to highlight which one this is. I think this is King James. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him, no, this is NIV, sorry, who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant found out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. Okay, and then you see those footnotes after those measures, 10,000 bags of gold, boop. 500 pieces of silver, boop. They are telling you these are translation issues we've chosen to render in a more functional equivalent type of a way. And the NIV is choosing to do it this way so that you know the king was owed a lot of money, 10,000 bags of gold, and the servant was owed a lot of money, 500 pieces of silver. That's different. We know that that's just a complete difference in scale. All right. The ESV has chosen to go a little bit more literal here. So this is verse 24 again. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. B. So the word in Greek is talentoi, which is just talent. It's a particularly difficult word to render into English because our word for talent means something like skill or ability. In the ancient world, it was a money word only. And so now we have a particular crossroads of, is he talking about skill, ability, like I need to use my spiritual gifts kind of a thing, or is it fiscal? And it's always just fiscal in the New Testament. And then in verse 28, when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And denarii is the ancient denarius, something like a day's wage. And so the ESV is choosing to bring in those ancient worlds forward. All right, any questions about that one? So one is not necessarily better or worse. These are just different translation choices for different reasons. What's kind of funny is in some of the most new updates, people will choose to make that word talent more functionally equivalent and then leave the word denarii there and make it more formally equivalent. And that tries to get away from the multivalency or the two meanings of the word talent. So that's kind of a fun one. All right, money, weights, measures. All right, second one, euphemisms. What is a euphemism? So a figure of speech which softens the blow of something. So like falling asleep instead of dead. What an excellent New Testament example. That's what Paul uses. So it's a polite way of saying something which would otherwise be either harsh, carry a lot of emotional weight, or be vulgar. All right, we're going to look at some, this is some of the more stark texts in the Bible, so not necessarily like content warning, but some of this stuff is a little bit straight ahead, shall we say. And so 2 Samuel chapter 13, 14. We'll first look at the ESV. Now this is, well, but he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. Okay, so lay with her is a euphemism. That is a formally equivalent euphemism. That's what the Hebrew says. It's the same word as like lay down or go to sleep. And what it's talking about is what it's talking about. This is euphemism. I forgot to footnote this next one. It's NIV. The NIV takes away the formal equivalence and it makes it more functionally equivalent. Ironically, it's much more stark in English when we read in the NIV. It says he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. So the NIV typically is a bit more paraphrastic, roundabout way of saying it, but when we talk about the euphemisms, these more functionally equivalent translations are more direct. So the ESV, typically a more direct translation when it comes to euphemisms, beats around the bush a little bit more, and then the NIV, typically a more dynamic translation, feels more straight ahead when we're talking about euphemisms, which is kind of a interesting backwards kind of a thing. So Genesis 31:35 has a different situation that requires euphemism. And this is the NIV. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So he searched but could not find the household gods. All right, the ESV is going to render it more precisely in the Hebrew way of going roundabout. So she said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." So he searched but did not find the household gods. Okay? So you see, again, the NIV is more direct, where often it feels a little bit more indirect, and the ESV feels indirect, even though it's closer to the original phraseology. So if you're reading the ESV and you don't happen to know those euphemisms, you might miss something. The NIV Translation Committee has decided to try to make that more clear for any English reader. We can decide which one is better or worse. It just is kind of how they're choosing it. So here, I'm saying both formal equivalences are more indirect, with their functional instances being a little bit more blunt. Oh. So I'm just trying to keep my eyeball on the old time here. Make sure we can get through all of the most important stuff. All right, so another particularly sticky wicket is vocabulary. So this is similar to euphemism, but it's different because in the Greek or Hebrew languages and some of the Bibles written in Aramaic, they just don't have all the same words that English or different receptor language has, and then vice versa. We don't have words for everything they had words for. So there's just not a one-to-one correspondence between languages. And that's a good thing. That's a beautiful thing. There's different ways. Like, I love the study of linguistics that studies how your vocabulary and way of speaking actually forms your brain and your way of looking at the world, right? So English, this is from Malcolm Gladwell's book. I can't remember the title of it, but he talks about the way that we do English numbers is like insane. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then 13, which is like 310. So 11 and 12 have no correspondence to 10, and then all of a sudden 13 comes out of nowhere. Boom, here it is. Does anybody know the word for 70 in French? 70, which means 60-10. What in the world is going on with that, you know? What a nutso number. And then, according to Malcolm Gladwell, in some Asian languages, the word for 11 is like 10-1, and then 12 is like 10-2, and they're all single-syllable words, so you can hold them in your brain a little bit more easily. Computation is often easier for Asian language speakers because of the language that the numbers are carried in. I thought that was fascinating. Yes, do you have a math question? Because I am the wrong guy. All right. 420s, 10. Capitalization, yeah. So French is a very interesting language as well. I forgot my French example at the beginning. The word for happy birthday in French is like bon anniversaire, which means like anniversaire is like anniversary. So then do we translate that happy anniversary, which is a more formally equivalent, or do we translate it happy birthday, which is a more functional equivalent, and therefore destroy the French original? And then the French came out with 90, and I was like, we will destroy French and say 90. Okay, so Greek is the same. There's all these like wild words hiding in Greek. There's all these wild words hiding in Hebrew that we have no real functional equivalence for or formal equivalence for. And so one of these in John 1:14 is the word monogenesis. This is a crazy word. So remember when we were reading through John 1:14 and it talks about the glory as of the only Son of the Father? They are all tripping over themselves to try to translate this word monogenesis. So you've seen that word mono before, which means something like singular or one or alone, right? Mono, when you're listening to music, thumbs down, right? Mononucleosis, thumbs up, I get to skip school, right? So we've seen this word mono. A lot of times it just means one. And then Genesis means something like beginning. So Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's where we get the word Genesis. That's the title of the book, in the beginning. The beginning. The Genesis is the source of, or that word Genesis comes from the Greek word genao, which means something like to beget or to have the children. It's the same root word as genealogy or family tree. So is this the beginning? Is that the meaning here? Or is it the genealogical facts that John has in play here? And what does it mean, one-time Genesis? I'd say we don't know. That's a little bit glib. They know. We figured it out. But it's just hard to get around it. We don't have a word that means monogenesis in Greek. So sometimes we're very clever and we just steal the words from Greek and make them English. Great job, English speakers. And then sometimes we render it a bunch of different ways. And so this is why glory is of the one and only, right? That's the mono part of Genesis. Glory as of a father's son for his only child. Possible. Most of our translations didn't go for that because it's Jesus, one son from the Father, God the Father. So we're talking about glory as of the only begotten Son as of the Father. Monogenesis. So all the translations are trying to get at this one single word a little bit of a different way. And it's like wild in there. So that's why they all had a footnote in that paraphrase. It took 6 or 7 or 8 English words to render monogenesis, one Greek word. This is a particularly sticky wicket because we don't have this singular word. And then kind of we talked about, last week or 2 weeks ago, we're talking about the word logos or word. Dwight, you had a question about that. What in the world does that mean? And so the word became flesh. So like the Passion Bible, I can't remember what it said. Something wild, you know. Conveniently, it's on the top of my trash pile. Praise the Lord. Yeah, so the living expression, it says, became a man. And so it's trying to get at that word for word, right? And word in English is tricky because it means like a singular unit of speech. But in Greek, it had something to do with more like an idea or like the consciousness or the thought realm of the universe. And then John appropriates that and makes it something like the divine incarnation. So this is a tricky one. So often we just go with word, but it gets a little bit complicated, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So this is just one verse from the Greek, a couple sticky wickets with our vocabulary because our English is either meaning 2 of the things and we wish it only meant 1, or we just lack the word for it. All right, here's a fun translation that Fee and Stewart bring out in their book, 1 Corinthians 7:36. In the King James, it says this: if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely towards his virgin, now that word virgin is the one we're going to be looking at, if she pass the flower of her age and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. All right? This King James is a little clunky. Right? So Fee and Stewart make the point that this cannot be right because that word virgin, or parthenos in the Greek, it's vague in English. We're going to look at 3 other options here, what that can more precisely mean. They make the point that Paul's readers knew which he was referring to. They're asking him a specific question about when it's okay to marry and when it's okay to have sexual relations. They know. We don't know. So we're kind of doing our best. But this is why they say it can't be right. It seems vague to us. It was not vague to the church at Corinth. So this is part of the translation journey. Next week, we're going to talk about getting back into the mind of the original readers. And so the ESV chooses it this way: if anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards his betrothed, and you see that footnote indicator there, they're making a translation choice to update that term virgin to betrothed, which you might say fiancé, same kind of a feeling here in English. If his passions are strong and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry, it's no sin. All right, the NIV does it similarly, but then they try to keep that feeling, right? If anybody is worried that he might not be acting honorably towards the virgin he is engaged to, so now they're bringing out the same marriage idea. All right, and then the NASB 1995 has a different rendering. If any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly towards his virgin daughter, italicized, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let her marry. All right, so here we're not talking about a fiance, we're talking about a daughter. So they're making a translation suggestion for you, and then they're putting it in the NASB in italics to highlight that word daughter is not in the original language. They are supplying it for you to guide you in the right direction. All right, most people think the ESV and NIV renderings here are better, but the NASB is possible. It could mean daughter, it could mean fiance. We're not really 100% sure. So this is all from one word, a particularly tricky vocabulary word. That's why they think, yeah, let's go with fiance, right? Why is he marrying his daughter? Let's not do that. All right. Wordplay. Puns. I love puns. Figures of speech. Love them. The best. All right?
Real quick, since we're on wordplay, are you going to deal with anthropomorphisms?
Nope. Although that would fall into this category. So Norris is asking me about anthropomorphisms, which are times that we ascribe human qualities towards God. Typically, anthropomorphism and figures of speech like that are fairly easy to carry across culturally, which is kind of nice, because it lodges, anyway. It works out good. Sometimes not as good. Here are some times where it's trickier. This is one of my favorite examples. Amos 8, 1 and 2. We're going to read the first, the NRSV. All right, and so Amos is prophecy, which means it's poetry. It's hard to find poetry. Again, like translating poetry is just hard to do, especially if you try to stick more towards word for word kind of stuff. I have destroyed the layout of the Bible to make it fit on the slides, but if you're opening it up in your print Bible, you'll see this is when you have like 4 or 5 words and then a line break, and 4 or 5 words and then a line break. That's a clue that you're reading poetry, even though it doesn't rhyme or have meter in English. So Amos is, in fact, poetry. And he says this, "Thus the Lord God showed me, and behold, there was a basket of summer fruit. He said, 'What do you see, Amos?' And I said, 'A basket of summer fruit.' Then the Lord said to me, 'The end has come for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer.'" All right, so what does the end coming for Israel have to do with fruit? No idea. Skip. Let's move to the Gospels, right? This is what we do to the Old Testament. I didn't do it. I was making fun of somebody else who's done it before, Norris. Hello. So the NIV tries to catch the poetic quality so you can get a little bit of the pun in Hebrew. He says, "This is what the sovereign Lord showed me, a basket of ripe fruit." "What do you see, Amos?" "A basket of ripe fruit," I answered. "Then the Lord said to me, 'The time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer.'" Okay? So now you get a sense of the connection between that ripeness and the judgment. And so the word for ripe fruit in Hebrew is ka'as, and then the end being near, the Hebrew word is kas. So ka'as to kas. It's a pun. They sound the same. Ka'as, kas. Hebrew readers would catch it. English readers are like, what does fruit have to do with judgment? There's just nothing there. So here, the NIV has changed those root meanings, or what they call a gloss, a word for word, so you get the poetic quality. I think a good choice here from the NIV. NRSV is more precise to what the actual Hebrew meanings are, but it's destroyed the poetry, sadly. Here's another example, Jeremiah 1, 11 and 12. Okay, we just talked about how great the NIV was at poetry. F- on this one. "The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah?" "I see the branch of an almond tree," I replied. "The Lord said to me, 'You have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled.'" So what does almonds have to do with watching to see? Right? Does it have to do with the blossoming, or like the season, or the time is right? So here we're going to go to the Message, a free translation. And again, one of the benefits of free is you get that poetic quality. This is what Eugene Peterson says. "God's message came to me. 'What do you see, Jeremiah?' I said, 'A walking stick, that's all.' And God said, 'Good eyes, I'm sticking with you. I'll make every word I give you come true.'" So here you catch the pun from stick to sticking with you, even though it's pretty far from the Hebrew, like watching over to see my word is fulfilled. Sticking with you is like kind of there, kind of distant. But the word for almond tree in Hebrew rhymes with the word for watching over in Hebrew. So there's a pun there. Almond tree rhymes with watch, but it doesn't in English. And so we have to get a little bit freer. So Eugene Peterson has dug deep in the closet, come out with walking stick and sticking with you. Great job. A+. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, one, like, how can you reconcile that? Like, you know, for me, like, when I read my Bible, I'm personally not thinking, let me read 3 translations of this one scripture
Mm-hmm.
to figure out what, you know, God wants me to figure out. And then the second question is, like, why so many translations? I mean, I'm thinking of the translation committee. I can see why there's a translation from the New King Version, but, like, to have so many translations within the last 5 years, I'm just like wondering why, like what is the incentive?
Yeah, so your questions are actually kind of linked together. So your first one is like, I forget exactly how you phrased it. I apologize. Your second one is like, why do we have so many? The reason we have so many is because it's tricky, right, to get the Hebrew stuff forward, and you have all this range of options. And so by having multiple translations to look at, you're going to get the more full sense of the scriptures. So you could read, if all you did was read the NIV here, you'd catch the poetic quality, but you'd understand the actual Hebrew words. If all you did was read the Message, you'd get the poetic quality, but you'd miss the Hebrew words. And so by getting both English translations under your belt, you get a better range of original understanding. This is the reason we can't just have like, why doesn't one good translation just solve it for everybody? You cannot do that. You have to pick formal, functional, or free equivalence. You know, it's kind of like saying like, why do we don't just have, I don't know, like translating medical stuff. Like, why don't we just do it right with some beauty? You have to have different translations for different situations. I'm not explaining it very well. In my mind, it's super clear. So just get up in here.
Like, you know, when we're doing our studies on our own or in community, like, how are you supposed to know, okay, well, let me check out the 2 other versions to make sure I'm not missing anything.
Okay, good question. Okay, and I'm glad you rephrased it because this is, I think, an excellent question. So we're in the weeds here a little bit, and so the good news is you don't have to stress out and read all of the translations. A lot of them do a really good job. And here at the end, when we talk about here's your one-stop shops, like you can be 2 thumbs up. I'd also say, Tisha, there's a little bit of a difference, in my view at least, between reading devotionally, which is what you're talking about. Why can't I just read my Bible and engage with the Lord? You 100% can. So pick one and stick with it. It's fine. If you wanted to go with more of like a study or a deep hermeneutics approach, that's where the range really can help you. So any of the stuff on our list that we're talking here tonight can be your one-stop shop, and you're going to be like really right in good stead. The stuff we're talking about is the trickiest parts of the scripture. So like, what's the deal with virgin in 1 Corinthians? Like, fortunately, our faith does not rise and fall on whether or not we've got that translation correct, right? This is a detail. On the stuff that matters a lot, we have solved it. You do not have to be worried that any of this is lost in translation. It's very faithful. Any stuff that's published, done by committees, it carries the message of the gospel forward in a way that can be trusted. So if you just want to read devotionally, any of these is great. If you want to study and look at it from all different aspects, the range of stuff is really good for you. So I know that is not a full answer to what you're asking, but we are running a little short on time, and so I want to talk about a couple of things and then hit everybody with a one-stop shop, because that's what you are here for anyway. Oh man, I changed my title. I'm so happy about this, because we're talking about grammar and syntax, which nobody loves except me. Hey-o, this is what we're talking about. Okay, so the genitive case. English noun system, super easy, not very precise. Does anybody in here speak Russian? Or German? Or Latin? Kinda? They have a case system for their nouns, right? And so does Greek. And Greek loves genitives. And in English, we don't have it. We have a different expression. We would say like of God, or of Jesus, or of me. And so sometimes it's possessive. So like my book in Greek would be the book of me. Does that mean the book about me? The book that I wrote? Or the book which I own? Grammatically, it can mean all of those things. In English, we don't have the grammatical range that Greek does, and so we get stuck with stuff like the righteousness of God. So is that like God's own righteousness? Is that righteousness that has qualities that remind me of God? Is that the righteousness which God has given to us? Throughout the Bible, it means all of those things, but an expression like righteousness of God is simply not precise enough. Although in Greek it is, in English it's not really. All right, and then faith in or faith of Jesus Christ. This is another tricky one too. Like, this is genitives that, are we saved by faith in Jesus Christ? Or are we saved by the faithfulness of Jesus Christ towards us? This is a tricky grammatic construction in Greek. Depending on what epistle you're reading, it can mean both of those things. And so we want to be precise how we render that. Grammatically speaking, they're exactly the same in the New Testament. This is why we have those range of translations to try to bring that forward more precisely. That's a Greek thing. This is why I'm saying wickets of stick, sticky wickets. And then the second tricky one is the Vav Consecutive. This is a Hebrew thing. It's a conjunction. It means something like and they stick it on front of a lot of words to keep their sentences connected together. So it's a punctuation mark, and it means and it's a poetic breaker. So in Genesis 1, there's a Vav on every single verse in there. It's like, and God did this, and God did that, and God did this, and God did that. But if you render that in English, it just feels repetitive and clunky, and like you need to send it back and get a new edit. In Hebrew, it feels poetic and like flowing and moving. So how do we do something like the Vav? How do we just leave a single word out of the Bible? Right, can we do it if it changes the wording of the Bible? So, because Hebrew is an Eastern Semitic language, its grammar is very different than our English one. Greek is a little closer to English, so it gets a little bit tricky. I wish I knew more about Chinese translations of the Bible, because I bet you that the Chinese language has a better, easier job with the Old Testament than English does, just because their language family is closer. And then the last particularly sticky one is gendered language. So how should we render ancient pronouns like he or ancient nouns like man? In that day, very often this was meaning something like humankind or humanity, or he and she. And now here in modern U.S. English, we don't speak like that as much anymore. We will say something like he or she, or they, or something like humankind. And so we get to make a choice when we have a word like he or man in the Bible, how are we going to render that? And so a great example of this is Genesis 1:26. This is the ESV. And then God said, let us make man, footnote, in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. All right, I know I'm going fast. We are short on time here. So it says, God said, let us make man in our image and let them have dominion. So we know that man is plural, meaning something like mankind or humanity. But they still use the singular man because that's closer to the ancient way of constructing it. All right, the ESV translation committee, on purpose, the ESV's purpose in life is to kind of bring translations back towards that word-for-word stuff. And so this is like a hobby horse of the ESV, is they'll do particularized gendered language even when it's probably inclusive. So right or wrong, this is just what the ESV does. This is something you need to know about the ESV if you're reading it. So they're going to bring the Greek or Hebrew forward, even if in English we would use something more plural. So for example, the New Revised Standard has changed it, and they say, let us make humankind in our image, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea. All right, so firstly, it's plural. It's not just Adam and Eve. It's talking about all of humanity, and the NRSV has removed any question, and it's just humankind. So different translations will approach this differently. One is not necessarily right. One is not necessarily wrong. It just is, you should be aware of what your own Bible is doing when it has these issues. All right, so another example is in the poetic sections of the Bible. So the NIV in the Psalms, it tends to be a bit more gender inclusive. So blessed is the one, which is a gender neutral word, who does not walk in step with the wicked or stand in the way that the sinners take, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord. And then in verse 3, they say, like that person. Whereas the ESV will say, blessed is the man, right? But then they footnote it because it's just people, it's humanity, but they want to keep the Hebrew sense of that word going forward. Oh, whoops, it didn't come up. Here we go. And here I've chosen to leave the paragraph breaks like they more are, because this is a poetic kind of a thing. Okay. We're almost there. Okay. all this stuff. Pick one. So, fee and short, these authors, they say that the best single-stop translation is a functional equivalence option like the NIV 2011. So the NIV was first done in 84, there's a 2011, there's a 2015, which was not great. 2011 is the one that they say you should go. And this is actually our default Bible at 3Crosses. So if you watch Church Online and you go into the Bible tab, it's NIV. In your Pew Bible, it's NIV. If it's on the screen, 9 times out of 10, it's NIV. Sometimes we will pick a different one because we prefer a rendering, but we'll usually make that clear. This is our default one. And then they say you should supplement that for study. So if you're reading devotionally, NIV is great with the Good News Bible, which they really like. I've never read. Holman Christian Standard, and then choose one of the NASB or NRSV. This is a good mix, they think, between the frees and the formal equivalences. But your best single stop is something in the middle like the NIV. But I say unto you, a very good single stop is the ESV. I like it a lot. Here are some reasons. It has amazing published versions. Whoever the ESV publishers are, they are killing it. So if you look online and you get a fancy like leather-bound Bible with a strap, like it's ESV. What about those fancy ones with the flowers? They're ESV. What about the ones with the margin notes? ESV. ESV is crushing it, right? Both because of their marketing, but also because it's really good. And there's something I think that's nice about a Bible which is just beautiful to look at, fun to hold, and fun to read. Like it just should compel you. And the ESV has done a very good job of that. I tend to lean more towards the formal equivalent side. Like I like it more literal. I like it more word to word. The ESV leans a little bit more that way than the NIV, but you have to be aware of its limitations. And so particularly around issues of male and female language, the ESV has some differences. It's different than NIV, which isn't bad, you just have to be aware of it. And then I would say supplement it with the Holman Christian Standard, New Revised Standard, and Message or Passion Bible if you want some of that free translation. All right, any questions about that? We got there. Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel about mixing translations, like when preaching or reading the best of different?
Yeah, so how do we feel about mixing translations? Sometimes it can be good, right? Because every translation has limitations, and by mixing them, sometimes you can bring out the best of all worlds. However, if you are not fluent in the original biblical languages, mixing translations often just turns into picking and choosing what you like and what you don't like. And then I get a little suspicious of that, because the translation committee has done a good job. And I say committee because no single person works on these. There's groups and teams and checks and balances. They do a good job on these things, bringing them forward. And so if you're just looking and cutting and pasting, what you have come up with is now your own commentary on the text, not something that looks back at the Greek or Hebrew in a systematic way. So when I preach and I choose ESV, it's because I've looked at Greek or Hebrew and I like it better for some important reasons. But I will not typically choose half a chapter of ESV and then switch horses midstream to NIV. Almost never. I feel like that's not the best way to go for it. Sometimes I'll use ESV at the top of a message, NIV later, but almost never. I just feel like sticking with one typically is better, if that makes sense. Dwight? So like culturally relevant Bibles, that can be really good, because we didn't talk a lot about receptor language, but that's like understanding the audience you're translating for. And so they can do a really good job at rendering idioms in a way that makes more sense. They can do a great job at bringing cultural issues to the forefront that some of the more like, I don't want to call them big box translations, but I think about like the ESV is like the Walmart of Bibles. It serves all people like pretty well, but there are some niches that it doesn't, right? And so a more culturally relevant Bible can bring some of those updates. But then again, any translation can be great or bad in its aims. And so there are very great cultural translations, and then there are really poor ones as well. So it just kind of depends on the specific. If you have a specific one in mind, email me. I'll take a peek at it and let you know what I think about it. Do you have one in mind? Mm-hmm. So there's an audio version of the Bible called the Streetlights Bible. Have you heard about this? And it is, I think it's an African-American produced audio version, which has things like music and rhythm and some updated language to bring it more current into that context. I think it's an amazing piece of work, and you should check it out. Streetlights Bible. And so it's more read out, and so that's almost like not like a translation because it's all the same words, but they bring it forward in that cultural sense that you're talking about that can sometimes be lost by just words on a page. I love songs we sing in church, for example, that have words of Scripture in them. That's a way of bringing culturally a different sense of just the rigidity and the woodenness of the words, but in a way that's really beautiful and helps us come around the Scriptures. Yes, ma'am.
In terms of like interlinear Bibles, where would that fit into like studies? Like, should we like start with the English and then like go? Because I'm wondering if it gets confusing.
Yeah, so interlinear Bibles, what you're asking about is a Bible that will have like a line of the English words over a line of the Greek or Hebrew words. And so that's what they mean. Interlinear means in between the lines. And so it just lays the Greek and Hebrew out for you there. And then some versions will have the Greek or Hebrew words but put into English letters. And so they call that transliteration. That is a high formal equivalent approach. They want you to make sure that there's a one-to-one correspondence between words or phrases. It can be a good tool to help you catch that one-to-one correspondence. But the problem with them is that it's almost impossible to understand because the word order is going to be funny and some of these expressions we're talking about you don't quite get. So using it as a balance against something like NAV can actually be a lot of fun as an extra tool. I don't think it's the best devotional Bible as a single stop. Okay, so we're a little over on time. Your kids don't have to be picked up for at least 60 more seconds, which is great. Hey man, what's the homework? And don't forget 5 or 4 translations. We will boo you off the stage. So here's your homework. You're going to read John chapter 15, but there's more. Use a few different translations. A few. What does that mean? This is a functional equivalence, right? And then I'd love for you to just make some notes where they have different word choices. So one thing that I do when I teach classes in the Gospels is we print out side by side and use colored pencils to indicate differences. That can be a really visually arresting way to do it. So consider doing that. Go to like Bible Gateway, print it out, or mark up the Bibles which you have. So note where they have different word choices and then note where they all line up. So both what's different and what's the same. So this is going to kind of teach us to catch, even at the sentence and phrase and word level, some of the differences. And so the next week, our key text will be something from John 15. We're going to discuss some particular wording choices and translation choices in a bit of the hermeneutical process called the Hermeneutical Spiral. So here's a fancy, easy nighttime read. If you can't sleep, just borrow this from me. It's called the Hermeneutical Spiral by Grant Osborne, and it talks about the journey of translation from word up to thought and so on and so forth. And we're going to talk about this next week. So easy, even a baby can do it. Pan comida, which means eating bread in Spanish, which means easy. Piece of cake, and then we have a special guest next week because I will be whisked away to a far and distant land called Nevada on a trip with my dad and brothers-in-law. And so, do not worry, no heresy will be spoken next week. If you bribed me, I will even tell you who the guest is. That's it. That's all the homework. Can I pray for us as we dismiss? All right. Lord God, we thank you for your word and for the gift of language, the gift of communication, the gift of cultural differences, the gift of history, the gift of time, the gift of your people throughout the centuries that have carried this message forward, translated it so that we can read your word in our original language. Speak to our hearts, we pray, Lord God, as we read these words in these pages. Father, would you enliven us with passion like those free translations help us to do? Would you enliven us with good doctrine like those formal equivalent translations allow us to do? Would you help us to find that balance and keep us devotionally passionate about your word and not so stuck in footnotes that we lose the sense and beauty of who you are? Father, may your gospel go forward. May it change our area. May it change our hearts and lives. And Father, may it be to your glory, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right. God bless you. We will see you next week. I need my walkout song now.